So have you ever heard of Marianne Williamson? How do you synopsize a life? Well, she's a best-selling author, an activist, a lover of humankind, a presidential candidate, and in the very best possible way, a provocateur. Yeah? I think she is the personification of the aphorism, I come to comfort the disturbed and to disturb the comfortable. If you look at her My Story section of her website, this is what she writes, and this is perfect for us today. Spiritual audiences haven't always been happy with my political activism. And political audiences haven't always been happy with my spiritual convictions. But the combination of the two is who I am. Yeah. So apropos of our theme this month, with her message this morning of self-mastery and moral leadership, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome back to our platform Ms. Marianne Williamson.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Reverend Doug. Thank you, Lynn Frankenberger. Thank you to all of you. It's a delight to be here. In the middle of a presidential campaign, as you can imagine, I feel like I'm in the belly of the beast here. I feel like I'm I'm inside the whale. And the idea of a Sabbath, whether it is at a church, whether it is a synagogue, any place where I can actually practice in my own life, that very, very necessary return to that place of wisdom and truth and clarity, that sweet spot that we all need in order to be replenished. Nothing could be more important to me at this time. And I also recognize, as I have, as Doug said, that interface, that intersection between those things which are religious and those things which are political. Mahatma Gandhi said that anyone who thinks religion doesn't have anything to do with politics doesn't understand religion. I thought it was so interesting. He didn't say anybody who doesn't think religion has anything to do with politics doesn't understand politics. He said anyone who doesn't think they belong together doesn't understand religion. We have separation of church and state in this country, and that's one of the most enlightened aspects of our Constitution. We all also need to remember what it is and what it isn't. When we were children, we read about how people came here to escape religious persecution. And I think we've all seen enough now, even in the last few years, we're adults now, we understand that's no small deal. We understand what an extremely important issue is, that here today, this morning, all of us are absolutely sure that no policeman is going to enter into the room today and tell us to break it up because this religion is not on the list. That's what separation of church and state is. It means no policeman's going to go into a mosque, into a synagogue, into a yoga studio, into a meditation group, into an AA meeting, into a church, or into a meeting of atheists. Because the freedom of religion includes the freedom to not worship. It's not only the freedom to worship however you want, but also the freedom not to worship. So it's a protection of the religious life. Remember, the founders weren't trying to suppress the religious conversation that way. They were protecting it. And then the other half of it, equally important, is that no minister or priest or rabbi or imam or ayatollah or anything like that is going to open up the doors at the U.S. Capitol, walk down to the podium and tear up a law and say you can't pass that law. Here you have to pass another one. That happens in countries like Iran, for instance, where the ayatollah, the religious leader, has the ultimate say politically. That will never happen here. So the separation of church and state means our government will not be interfered with by religious authorities, and those of us who worship or not worship will not be interfered with in that decision by governmental authorities. It's important that we understand that. And it's also important to understand what the Johnson Amendment was that has to do with what churches can or cannot do on the pulpit. If Reverend Doug were to say specifically, we endorse this candidate, he would be risking the tax-exempt status. If he were to say specifically, we endorse this piece of legislation, that would be risking his tax-exempt status. But that's it. It does not mean you can't let it rip about what you believe. It does not mean you can't let it rip about what your heart has to say. It does not mean you can't let it rip about your spiritual convictions on the pulpit, and that's what I intend to do today. You know, a lot of people don't recognize the practical relevance of the great spiritual and religious themes. And when you look at what is in Christianity, the relationship between the crucifixion and the resurrection, when you look in Judaism in the Old Testament, the relationship between the Pharaoh enslaving the Israelites, the relationship between that and the journey to and ultimately the entrance to the Promised Land. And when you recognize the same basic theme in the fact that Buddha was born as a very he was born to a very powerful king. His father was a very powerful king. This is particularly interesting in his life because when Siddhartha, his name was Prince Siddhartha, and when he was born, his father was told by a seer or an astrologer, we don't know what all that was at the time, but he was told that your son, this child, will grow up to be either a great holy man or a great military warrior. Now the father, the king, was a great military warrior, and he wasn't going to have any of this stuff with my son going to be a holy man. He said, no, that's not going to happen. So he drew up a plan to make sure that his son would not become a holy man, but that he would sort of stay in the circle of his father's life and become a great military king like his father. And the plan was to build a wall around the palace compound. And all that Siddhartha would ever experience there would be comfort and peace and joy. He would only have the greatest teachers, the greatest cultural experiences, everything that could make him happy, dancers and singers, and then he grew up, women, everything he could possibly want. And that was the father's plan to make sure he will stay here within the circle. But there was a gnawing at his heart. Siddhartha did get married. He did follow his father's plans. But something in him knew there was something there on the other side of the palace walls. So one night, as a young man, Siddhartha escaped. He crawled over, and he saw things that he had never seen inside the compound. He saw suffering, and he saw sickness, and he saw death. And he was very shocked by these things, and he was trying to figure out what this would mean for his life. And then in the middle of the night, he crawled back over to go back into his bed, to go back into the palace compound. But because it was the middle of the night, he saw something even there that he had never seen before. Because he saw all the dancers while they were sleeping. He saw all the singers while they were sleeping. He saw all his teachers, all the people who were there to just give him joy while they were sleeping. And he walked up close to them and he saw they too suffer. They too have illness. Behind the facade, these are clearly human beings who suffer too. And that is when he knew that there was something he was not seeing. That's when his eyes were opened. And that is when he left the palace compound for the final time and became a holy man and ultimately the Buddha. His main message to the world was the same as crucifixion. His message to the world was the same as the Israelites suffering as slaves in Egypt. And that is that life is suffering. Whether the symbol is the crucifixion, or the Pharaoh, or the story that I just told you. That's the point. A life lived here is dominated by suffering, but there is a journey that we all take out of the suffering. The crucifixion leads to the resurrection. The suffering in Egypt led the Jews ultimately to the Promised Land. And Buddha ultimately recognized that while his message was that life is suffering, in the presence of ultimate and infinite compassion, all suffering ends. Nothing could be more relevant than to understand that patterning. Nothing could have more practical applicability than to understand that pattern. It is to see all of our suffering as individuals, and all of our suffering collectively as coming from that same place. And that place is within us. I remember saying to myself many years ago not to worry about the devil because, you know, Marianne, there's nothing out there stalking the planet, seeking our souls. And I remember saying to myself, Marianne, you just don't have to worry about any of that, honey, because that's all in your head. And then I stopped for a moment and I thought, that is so the worst place it could possibly be. And so to say that it's all in your head is not necessarily good news. And that is where the crucifixion starts. That is the crucifixion. It's in our head. That is the Pharaoh who enslaved the Israelites. It's in our head. It is a force of consciousness. And it is within us all until we reach that spot of enlightenment. And the whole point of religious practice, of spiritual practice, the whole point of the great religious and spiritual masters is the idea that some have reached that point. Some have reached that point, and then they become the way-showers. They become the teachers. They are the masters. And they have walked the journey. They have walked the distance from the place of fear, from the place of invalidation, from the place of suffering, from the place of crucifixion, from the place of slavery, whether it is internal or external slavery, and they have made it home. They have made it into the space of the resurrection. They have made it into the space of the promised land. They have made it into the space of ultimate compassion. That is the only thing going on this planet. That's the only thing that's going on in your life, and it's the only thing going on in my life, and it's the only thing going on collectively. It's one big story. And it has a lot of different details and vicissitudes, and it looks a little different here, and it looks a little different there. And in one person's life, it's their divorce. In another person's life, it's their cancer diagnosis. And in another person's life, it's bankruptcy. And in another place, it's a war in Yemen. And in another place, it's conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. And in another place, it's hungry children. And in another place, it's starvation. But it's all the same story. There's what fear would do, and there's what love would do. And all that fear is lovelessness. Remember, fear is not a thing of itself. Fear is to love what darkness is to light. When you say what darkness would do, well, actually, darkness doesn't do anything. It's just that when you walk into a room where there's not light, you can't see. So when love's not there, you're blind. We're spiritually blind. We can't see. And we make wrong decisions, and we do stupid things. And that's because in the absence of love, there is fear. And how do you get out of that situation? How do you walk that path? What is that? And that's where Moses comes in. That's where the 40 days for Buddha, the 40 years for the Israelites, the 3 days for the Christians, that journey, that period of time between the condition of darkness and the condition of light, that twilight time. That is the question. How do we exit the pain and the suffering? Because there is no greater image of pain and suffering than the crucifixion of an innocent man. There is no greater suffering than slavery, and that is what the slavery of the Israelites in our collective human experience. There is no greater suffering than all the suffering that Buddha saw. You can't leave out that recognition of the suffering. And any spiritual path, any religious path, any type of spiritual perspective that leaves out the recognition of the suffering is not spirituality, it's denial. There's a difference between transcendence and denial. If you only focus on the crucifixion, you only focus on slavery in Egypt, you only focus on the suffering, then it's true, it expands. But I think sometimes we have a misunderstanding even, we don't look deeply as we might at what it means to say, sometimes people say, well, don't look at the bad stuff because it expands. Can you imagine going to an oncologist and he says, or she says, you have stage 1 cancer, but let's not focus on it because it'll expand. It's quite the opposite. Some bad things grow and get worse if you don't focus on them. So what the Course in Miracles says is look at the crucifixion, but do not dwell on it. So if you don't look at it at all, you're not transcendence, you're in denial. But if you look at it and focus on it too much, then you actually become part of the problem. This is why the spiritual journey matters and why it is so applicable. Because with the spiritual journey, you understand that. With the spiritual journey, you understand, no. We're not going to look away from hungry children. That's not an option. We're not going to not look at the fact that a school principal, public school principal here in Las Vegas told me that she has elementary school students on suicide watch. And that when she called your school district, because you have the school district had appointed some mental health counselors. We only have one mental health counselor for every 1,500 children in the United States public schools. So she called the school district, and she said, well, I'm told that you have these mental health counselors, and I need one because we have elementary school students here in my school on suicide watch. This is in Las Vegas, ladies and gentlemen. And she was told that they couldn't send her one because her school is not one of the worst. The spiritual seeker does not look. The spiritual seeker does not like cross over that because it's not convenient. It's not celebratory enough. You celebrate once you got something to celebrate. And what you have to celebrate is what happens when you stare that stuff down. That's when you celebrate, when you handled it. Somebody was telling me the other day about the famous line from Winston Churchill that we all know, blood, sweat, and tears. But my friend pointed out to me, she said, you know, when you look at his actual speech about that the line, blood, sweat, and tears, comes from, that what's commonly left out is a word that's very important because he referred to blood, sweat, toil, and fear, and tears. Toil. We become too easy on ourselves in our generation. We don't want to have to toil. We don't want to have to toil. Somebody was saying to me the other day, are you taking care of yourself? Are you practicing self-care? Which on one hand I appreciate. And I understand the validity of the concept of self-care, and I try to practice it as does any healthy person. On the other hand, why have we become so soft? Why have we become so precious? You know, people tell me they're very traumatized by the times in which we're living. Trauma? Really? Do you think that the people who were walking across the bridge at Selma were not traumatized? Because they didn't know if they were going to bring the dogs out. They didn't know if they were going to bring the hoses out. They didn't even know if they were going to bring the bullets out. You think the women suffragettes weren't a little anxious when they were thrown into jail and the conditions in the prison? And remember what they were thrown into jail for. They simply marched so that women in this country could have the right to vote. Because they felt if women couldn't have the right to vote, they wouldn't be able to change anything. A woman, if she wanted a divorce, could only have it if her husband gave it to her. And even if he gave it to her, she could leave the house. This is a man, let's say he was beating her regularly and beating the children. Well, she had a choice. I mean, she could leave him if she wanted, but she couldn't take the kids. And even if she had brought money into the marriage, she could walk away with one small suitcase with whatever she wanted, and that was all. She couldn't have the kids, couldn't have the money, so she would just have to stay there, even if he was beating her. So women thought, well, if women could vote, we could change these things. And they were thrown in jail, they were thrown in prison, and then the conditions in the prison were so horrifying that they went on a hunger strike. And then the response of the prison was to send men into their cells and force these metal contraptions onto their necks to force feed them. They were probably a little anxious, don't you think? Civil rights workers, the abolitionists, the suffragettes, Moses. It's all the same thing. It's what happens when somebody says, we're not going to just stay in this condition. We're not going to do that. We're not going to stay in this condition. You see, nature has the imprint by which night turns into morning. Nature already has the imprint by which all that is night turns into new morning. But in human life, free will means, yes, as the Course in Miracles says, God's will has never not been done. Our night will turn into morning. This planet will one day stop it with the perpetual war. We will one day be at peace. We will one day be a planet which is repaired. We will one day be a planet in which freedom does ring. The only question, and that question is up to us. The answer to this question is up to us. The question is, how much more suffering will it take before you choose that path? And will the earth even tolerate our being here while it repairs itself? You see, we ourselves have to make a decision here. Are we willing to toil? Are we willing to show up for the journey? Are we willing to take that journey out of slavery into freedom? Are we ready to walk that path from crucifixion to resurrection? Are we ready to, as Buddha did, move from that place of hatred and fear and move into that place of infinite compassion. Because nature is self-organizing. As long as we love each other, as long as we put love first, everything does work pretty well in our lives. All of us know that. If you try to be more loving, you try to be more compassionate, you try to be more forgiving, you try to take responsibility for your issues, to recognize your character defects, to atone for your mistakes, to make amends, to try to be a better person, to recognize where you have some things to learn, to recognize where the part you played in your disasters. You try to show up, you rise to the occasion, you'll say, I'll be a better person next time. Life does have a way of resetting things. We know that in our individual lives. And all that politics is our collective experience. We know that in our own personal lives, you want things to change, you're going to have to look in the mirror. If the United States wants some things to change, we're going to have to look in the mirror too. And that's all that's happening. That's all that's happening on this planet. The same dramas are unfolding collectively as unfold individually. And we know in our individual lives, you ready to get naked before God? You ready to get real? You ready to tell some real truth? You ready to get down? You want to look at yourself honestly? And in those places where you're not really clear, you know what? Your best friends probably are clear. And if you really want to ask some people, tell me the real truth about myself, there are probably more than enough people who, once you ask, would be willing to tell you. And that's what conscious people want. Because conscious people know, otherwise I'm just going to continue to create these same dramas over and over again. So you have two choices. You have the choice of the pain, and sometimes it is painful, of self-discovery, or the endless ache of a dysfunctional, neurotic life where the pain is always in the background, but you're not really conscious of where it comes from, so you can't really transform it, and you stay stuck on the cross of your own crucifixion for the rest of your life. And nothing is ever working out, nothing is ever really, people aren't loving you the way you want, you're not succeeding the way you want, nothing's quite breaking through the way you want, you're always trying, and it just never breaks through because you haven't gone deep, and you haven't gotten real, and you haven't told the truth. But once you do, it all breaks free. Nature self-corrects, and that's what this country needs to do now. Abolitionists had to be honest. They couldn't pretend slavery wasn't happening. And the women's suffragettes had to get honest. They couldn't pretend that the suppression of women wasn't happening. And the civil rights movement, Dr. King, they had to get real. They couldn't pretend that segregation wasn't happening. They couldn't pretend that institutionalized white supremacy wasn't happening. What, would that have been spiritual to deny those things? There's nothing spiritual about complacency, and there is nothing negative about yelling, fire, fire, if, in fact, the house is burning down. So nothing could be more spiritual than to be willing to look at the crucifixion. Nothing is more spiritual than to be willing to say, these kids, there's 13 million children in this country are hungry, and some of them are in Las Vegas. We have 100,000 homeless children in the United States, and some of them are in Las Vegas. Here, when I was at the 3 Square, here in Las Vegas. And you see, running for president, I have the privilege, I see this all over the country. I don't see it any more or any less in Las Vegas than anywhere else. But everywhere I see it, I can't believe this is the richest country in the world. So I go over to 3 Square, your food pantry, and I'm told by people there, well, you know, one of the problems we have is we give some food to these kids on Friday, but we really don't know if they'll be able to eat over the weekend because we don't know if some adult or somebody else in the family will take their food, and how will they really get fed before Monday. Here. Now, why is that? It's not because any of us as individually would tolerate that. We're good people. We're decent people. But the problem is that our collective behavior, and the word for that is politics. The word for that, that's what government is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a representation. Remember, representative democracy. Our government is supposed to be representing our consciousness and our will. Our consciousness is good. We're good and we're decent. We don't want to see children starve. We don't want to see children uneducated. We don't want to see situations where some people just don't have a shot at it in life. None of us want that. And yet our government has been so corrupted by the big money of huge industrial, multinational corporate forces and their short-term profits that are placed before the idea that first you feed the babies. that are placed before the idea that you must have ethical and moral consideration for people and for planet, that we must have ethical and moral consideration for ourselves, for our children, for other people's children, for the people of the world, and for the planet on which we live. That we absolutely must care, not just about endless preparation for war, but of at least making a proactive effort to create peace in our time. And if not in our time, could we at least think about it for our children or our children's children? Because no person lives a deep and meaningful and spiritually aligned life who thinks only of ourselves. And no generation is living a meaningful and aligned and spiritually correct life if we are thinking only for ourselves. The spiritual awakening that this country needs is not based on ideas that are not known by all of us. Everything I'm talking about, these are principles which those of us who go to church, those of us who go to synagogue, those of us who go to mosque, those of us who go to AA meetings, those of us who go to therapy, which is millions and millions and millions of Americans. We know these principles. And most of us can now say, one of the reasons I know these principles is because I tried them in my life. And I'm not the same person because I tried them in my life. And because I've applied them to my life, I see that they work. I see that when I try to be forgiving rather than judgmental, when I try to bless instead of blame, when I get off the victim thing and show up for life and try to be a better person, I've seen how life repairs itself. Now, that might not mean you're perfect at it. I'm not perfect at it. Might not mean that any of us practice it 24/7. But we know these things enough. We might not be, PhD students in enlightenment yet, but we're in college. And at this point, it's not like any of us need to know any more facts because we know the facts. Everything that I've talked to you about today, even things going on in Las Vegas, you knew that. I might have mentioned a couple of details that you didn't know. The issue isn't that what we don't know, it's what we're not looking at, what we're not owning, what we're not admitting that we know. And that is why the difference between being anti-slavery and being an abolitionist means so much. Being anti-slavery just means you didn't agree with slavery and you wouldn't do it. Noble. But that of itself would not have moved the needle for one enslaved person. But the person who was an abolitionist across the bridge, that's the Moses journey. That's those 3 days. That's those 40 days and those 40 years. The abolitionist was someone who crossed the bridge from I don't agree with it to not on my watch. And that's a psychological bridge, and that's an emotional bridge, and that's a spiritual bridge. And there is something in all of our lives called the appointed hour. We were blind, and after that appointed hour, we see. And once we see, we can't not see. And we realize we've been so afraid of opening our eyes. And then we realize once we do open our eyes, that's where the power lies. Because you realize, wow, I'm so much more grown up than I was when I pretended not to see. I was a little girl before in a woman's body. I was a boy before in a man's body. And you take that, and you take the idea and the fact that you know that God works miracles inside us when we're willing to see, when our eyes do open. And when you take that power, the power of that knowing, and you mix it with the power so great, greater than any power on this earth today, which is the power of being a citizen in the most powerful and richest nation in the earth. You're holding so much power. I'm so tired of people saying, Marianne, how do I get my power? You know the answer about how you get your power? Use your power, and use it on behalf of someone other than just yourself. And when we do that, as it says in the Course in Miracles, moving mountains is small compared to what you can do. The abolitionists did it. The women's suffragettes did it. The civil rights movement did it. Now it's our turn. And for those of you who are here in Nevada, one of those early primary states, you've got such power. It's such an honor to be able to speak into the listening of people who have not only the spiritual understanding, but all that political power in your hands. As Doug said, that's my sweet spot. I hope it will be yours too. Thank you very, very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I've been asked by Doug to lead the offering, which I am more than glad to do. Part of putting feet to our prayers is being willing to give grounding to what we want to have happen. I know it as a political candidate, and political candidacies, it has to do with donation to the political campaign. At a church, it has to do with offerings. It's where we say, I am willing to actually put a dollar, I'm actually willing to put money into the materialization and the manifestation of what occurs here. And so let us do that, and let us remember as well, of course, that the law of circulation is such, we have to keep that money moving in order to have the blessing of it thereby. I want to tell one little story about that. Many, many years ago, it was back in the 1980s, my mother came to visit me in Los Angeles, and she walked into my bedroom, and she saw all these little cards on my bed. And she said, "What is that?" And I said, "Oh, these are my donations for the month." And she started laughing. She said, "You have no money." I said, "Well, I give $16 to Danny Thomas because we're healing childhood leukemia." And I told her the other things, and I was giving $10 a month to this, and I was giving $10 a month to that. I was giving $75 a month. My mother said, "You're the only poor philanthropist I've ever met." But I remember how empowered I felt, particularly because Danny Thomas said, we're going to heal childhood leukemia. And I remember I would see those commercials on TV. And the fact that I was giving $16, I remember how I used to feel. I used to feel, oh, we're on it. We're on it. Because my $16. And I also came to see the universe adds zeros when you put the first numbers in. So the idea that you're supporting this church, that you're supporting the functioning of this church, so that it can do what it does for you and for the community. There's something powerful here that does more than blesses the church. Clearly, it blesses you. So let's pray, and then do that which Spirit moves us to do, to give the offering so that this church can continue to thrive. Dear God, we place in your hands all that we have and all that we are. As we make this offering here to the church today, may our money be used in ways that you would guide, in all ways to foster the growth of the people who are here, the thriving, the service, the highest level of functionality. And as we give our individual offerings, may they together form a powerful lifeblood of the material functioning of this church, that love might prevail here and in all places. And so it is. Amen.